I'm Dan Bauer, and this is CBA Office Hours. This is an online forum where Patrick Kern and I talk about issues and questions that come up in the context of statistical analyses in the behavioral health and social sciences. Today I'm going to give an introduction to latent class analysis and latent profile analysis. And what you see up here are some questions that we're going to use to motivate the discussion. So we're going to pretend that we're political scientists and that we're interested in understanding heterogeneity within the Republican voter base. And so we've asked a series of questions of self-identified Republicans regarding what issues are most important to them. And so I'll come back to this in just a moment. But first I just want to say that latent class analysis and latent profile analysis have been around for a long time. Some of the seminal references on these techniques, like Gibson and Lazarsfeld and Henry, they date back to the 1950s and 1960s. But more recently, latent class analysis has been folded into sort of a generalized latent variable modeling perspective. And it's with that development that really these models have taken off quite a lot in the last couple of decades. So we've seen more and more applications of latent class analysis in the literature. So as a point of comparison, I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the most familiar latent variable model, the factor analysis model, and then I'm going to contrast that to latent class analysis. I'll talk a little bit about how latent class analysis and latent profile analysis are related. In my view, they're really sort of the same model. There's just a slight difference in the use of those terms owing to the historical developments that came before sort of this generalized latent variable modeling framework that we have now. So I'll talk a little bit about the relationship of those two. I'll also use this example to help motivate why you might use a latent class analysis and some of the unique insights that a latent class analysis can provide when doing a data analysis. So we'll use this example where our interest is to identify subgroups within the Republican base. We might be interested in that because if we're political scientists, we want to know what heterogeneity exists there. If we're campaign managers, we might want to know how to better market our campaign material. And so you do tend to see a lot of different kinds of uses of latent class analysis, sometimes to simply understand heterogeneity, as in the political scientist who wants to know what kinds of voters exist within the Republican bloc, and at other times to better direct campaigns or interventions, marketing, those kinds of things. So there are a variety of potential uses of these models, and we'll use this example to help give a sense of that. So to start off with, let's say we approach this from the standpoint of a factor analyst. Is we have a set of items here that we've asked Republican voters how important those issues are to them. And we might use a factor analysis model to try to do some reduction of the data, to try to understand the latent structure behind this. And we might posit three primary latent factors here. And so let's say we have factor 1, and factor 1 is going to represent sort of a tough stance on crime, on guns, on sort of America first, and on national security. And so this factor, which, I don't know, maybe we'll think of that as sort of a toughness factor, is going to load predominantly on those items. And then we might have factor 2, and factor 2 might be primarily a kind of a social conservatism factor, and we might have that load on those items there. How important is the Supreme Court nomination, pro-life, gay marriage, and then this third factor might represent sort of a traditional fiscal conservatism. And so we have a three-factor model, and those three factors are going to be correlated with one another to some degree, right? And so in a factor analysis model, what we're doing is we're saying we can subset these items into clusters of items that group together that reflect a common factor, right? So we have these three items, Supreme Court, pro-life, gay marriage, reflecting a common factor of social conservatism. And that factor is continuous. So it represents a continuum of viewpoints from more conservative to less conservative. And we could rank order individuals on that from high to low. And similarly, we have a fiscal conservatism factor that we believe is continuously distributed, and we could rank order people from high to low. And these factors are linearly associated with one another. So we might get a positive correlation between social conservatism and fiscal conservatism such that if you're higher on one, you tend to be higher on the other. Now that's the traditional factor analytic way of approaching the problem. But what if we don't have a good sense of what that underlying latent space is? Maybe we don't want to posit that there's necessarily three factors. Maybe we don't want to say that these factors are linearly associated with one another. And maybe we're not interested in continuous gradations of views on social conservatism and fiscal conservatism. Instead, what we're interested in is, are there social conservative voters? Are there fiscally conservative voters? Are there voters who are primarily motivated by things like national security standpoint and being tough on crime? Are there these voter blocs that exist within the Republican Party that are heterogeneous with respect to one another, right? So that differ in terms of their principal issues of concern. So we could do away with these continuous latent factors. So I'm just going to erase those. And instead, we could say that there exists a discrete latent class variable, right? So this discrete variable is going to consist of groups. So I'm not going to draw arrows to everything, but you can just sort of imagine that latent class variable is influencing each one of these indicator variables or issues. And so what this latent class variable is going to do is we're going to posit, maybe there's 2 groups, maybe there's 3 groups, maybe there's 4 groups. We give it some number of groups, and then we look at the profile of responses. Right? So given that you're in group 2, what's your probability of endorsing national security as an issue of concern? Sort of an America First attitude or American exceptionalism, being tough on crime, importance of gun rights, and so on down the list. So what's the probability of endorsing these particular issues as being particularly important and motivating for you? So one class might have high probability of endorsing some of these items, another class might have higher probability of endorsing some of those items. Now, how this differs from the factor analysis, first this is a discrete latent variable, so it's a grouping variable. You're either in one group or another, and your group determines your profile of responses. So we're not going to estimate multiple continuously distributed latent factors and try to triangulate you in some kind of continuous latent space. Instead, we're going to take patterns of responses and we're going to identify prototypical latent classes, prototypical subgroupings that characterize those patterns. Now these might be the true groups, so we might theoretically believe that there exist fiscal conservatives and social conservatives, and a 2-class model would split those 2 types of voters apart. But they might also be simply approximations, right? So every model is a simplification, every model is an approximation, every model is false in some sense. So there might not just be social conservatives and fiscal conservatives, there might be lots of different classes, lots of different patterns of responses among the Republican base. But we're going to boil that down into a smaller number that makes analysis more tractable, easier to identify policies, easier to market campaigns, and so forth. So we may or may not believe that these latent classes, that's the true structure behind the data. Instead, they may simply be approximating a complex underlying latent space. And that latent space might be continuous, but it might not be. And if it is continuous, we're getting an approximation that doesn't require us to indicate a certain number of factors or that the factors are linearly related to one another. Instead, we can pick up any kinds of nonlinearities or unusual trends through the estimation of these class profiles. All right, so how do we determine how many latent classes there are? Well, we fit a model with 2, with 3, with 4, with 5, with 6, and we see which model fits the data best. That's typically the way that we go about it. And there are a variety of different ways we can identify which model is the best. That's sort of a topic in its own right. There's a lot of research on class enumeration. But generally, the indices that people tend to prefer are the Bayes Information Criterion, or BIC, and you try to identify the model with the best BIC. What that does is it tells you what model generates the highest likelihood of observing the data, but it penalizes for the number of parameters because, of course, the more classes you give a model, the more parameters you have, the less parsimonious the model is. But, of course, it's going to fit better because it has lots more parameters to try to accommodate patterns within the data. So we want to counterbalance that loss of parsimony with the gain in fit and try to identify the most parsimonious model, and BIC is one way of trying to do that. We can also use Bootstrap likelihood ratio tests to compare formally the fit of 2 models with different numbers of classes to one another, so a 2-class model versus a 3-class model, and obtain a p-value indicating whether moving to a 3-class model results in a significant improvement in fit, or likewise moving to a 2-class model leads to a significant decrement in fit. So that's how we generally go about identifying the number of latent classes that are present. And so here, we might identify, let's say, 3 latent classes, where we have one latent class that represents our sort of classical fiscal conservatives. And those individuals have particularly high probability of endorsing these items of lower taxes, free trade, reduce the deficit, and small government. So that might be one class has a particularly high rate of endorsing those items. And then we might have another class that is sort of more in line with social conservatism issues. And so these individuals might have particularly high probabilities of endorsing those items. That the Supreme Court appointment is very important to them, that pro-life attitude is important, and attitudes towards gay marriage. And then we might have a third class, and that class might also find the Supreme Court appointment to be very important, so they might have a high probability on that, but they're motivated more by these other issues, and so gun rights and Supreme Court appointment are related to one another. Attitudes towards crime, also related to how the Supreme Court is going to rule on things. And then those things might tie into a more assertive stance in terms of national security and trade policy and other issues with nationalism. Right? Now those folks, having those nationalist tendencies, also might mean that they are less likely to endorse this free trade item. And so you can see how some items are going to be discriminating in different ways for different groups, and other items are going to be not discriminating between a couple of different groups. So our latent class analysis is going to pull out these three different groups of voters, and that might enable us to better target our interventions, right? So our campaigns is, if you're a campaign manager, when you're sending out campaign materials, you're essentially intervening and you're trying to increase voting behavior, increase donations, and that sort of thing. So identifying these blocks enables us to target our marketing or our interventions perhaps more effectively. It also enables us to just simply better understand the heterogeneity that exists within our data. Now, what's the difference between this kind of latent class model versus a latent profile analysis? Actually, there's virtually no difference at all. Latent class analysis, originally that term referred to a latent structure like this, where these indicator variables are all binary or ordinal, right? So categorical indicator variables. In contrast, latent profile analysis originally was developed with this very same structure, but where these indicator variables are continuous and have a conditional normal distribution. So given class membership, variability on each one of these items would be continuous and normally distributed. But they're essentially the same model, and in both cases, we assume that the responses to these items are going to be conditionally independent given latent class membership. That is, once we've identified a sufficient number of latent classes, there should no longer be any association within class on these variables. So given that you're in the fiscal conservatism class, there should no longer be any correlation between these items, right? Everyone is sort of equally high in their endorsement of these items or in their means for continuous responses related to these items. So both latent profile analysis and latent class analysis have the same underlying structure. There's a discrete latent variable that accounts for the associations among the indicators, and in both cases our focus is on the profile of responses, whether that profile consists of means, as in a latent profile analysis on continuous indicators, or that profile consists of endorsement probabilities if these were binary indicators in a more traditional latent class analysis. Now, given the sort of modern views on latent variable models, we can view both latent profile analysis and latent class analysis as essentially the same model. It's taking a generalized linear modeling kind of perspective. It's simply choosing the appropriate response distribution or conditional distribution for your item. So if you have a binary item, then use a binary distribution. If you have a continuous item, then maybe a normal distribution. And you could have other kinds of items too. So you could have count items with, let's say, a negative binomial distribution as well. Now, from that standpoint, there's no need to kind of draw a bright line between latent class analysis and latent profile analysis. We don't need to have all items be binary and then be in a latent class analysis, or all items be continuous and then be in a latent profile analysis. We can have mixes of items. Some of these items might be binary, other items might be continuous. We can even throw a couple of count items in there. And from the standpoint of a generalized latent variable model, it's all just latent class analysis. In each case, we're positing a latent class variable to account for the associations among the items, and we're trying to draw out the subgroups or prototypical patterns that are present there. All right, so regardless of what we call it, whether we call it latent class analysis or latent profile analysis, one of the insights that the model is going to bring to us is what are those prototypical patterns that exist within the population. They may not be the true groups. Of course, there's going to be more than 3 patterns of variation in the issues that Republican voters regard as important, but it's a simplification, it's an approximation, it's a data reduction that enables us to get some traction on that heterogeneity. All right, so then once we have our latent classes, what do we do with them next? Is typically we're going to want to do some kind of construct validation, demonstrate the usefulness of these latent classes. Right? No models are true, but some models are useful. And so we want to demonstrate the usefulness of our model. We might want to understand what is it that leads to this heterogeneity. Can we predict who's in which group? And so we might include a number of predictor variables, whether someone comes from a rural community, whether someone is college educated, whether the person is male, maybe their income. Right? So these might be a few different demographic variables that we could use to try to predict what class a person is in, and so we would regress latent class membership on these 4 predictor variables to try to see, do we get some predictive power. And so for instance, we might find that college-educated individuals with high income who don't come from rural communities, are more likely to come from urban communities, are more likely to be in this fiscally conservative class. I have no idea that's how it would come out, but it seems plausible to me. So that's one thing we can do for construct validation, is see if the latent classes relate to background variables in the way that we think they ought to. We can also look at how classes predict outcomes. And so we might say, well, these different profiles of voters, they might have different attitudes toward current political leadership. Right? So we might ask them, Paul Ryan is well known for fiscal conservatism, and so we might ask them of their opinions of Paul Ryan. Right, and how he's doing, their approval ratings for him. In contrast, Trump is more known for his views on sort of nationalist tendencies, America First being his primary campaign slogan, and also talking a good bit about national security and gun rights, and recently making the Gorsuch appointment. And so, groups that view those things as important may be more favorable towards him. And so we can imagine that we would get differential prediction of attitudes, of opinions about approval opinions regarding Paul Ryan's performance versus Donald Trump's performance to this point. All right, so those are some outcome variables that we could explore to see whether or not these different groups give us some predictive power, some discriminant predictive power there. All right, so hopefully that gives you kind of a sense of some of the insights that latent class analysis or latent profile analysis can give you, and the sorts of analyses that are typically done there. Now this is still a relatively simple model, and there are a variety of things we could continue to talk about that are all sort of issues in their own right. So for instance, how do we best estimate these kinds of relationships between external variables, background variables, outcome variables, and latent classes? And there's a sort of a proliferating recent literature on the best way to do that. There are 1-step approaches and 3-step approaches, and we could talk more about that. We could also talk more about how do you determine how many latent classes are there, so the class enumeration literature. And then there are a variety of ways of extending the structure of this model. So for instance, we might have this same kind of latent class structure at multiple time points. Maybe we conducted this survey over each of the past 3 presidential election years, and so we could see, do we get the same profiles in each of those presidential election years, and do their relative proportions stay the same? If we've surveyed the same people across those election cycles, then we could also see, do people sort of remain within their latent class, or do they transition from one latent class to another over time, and what transition patterns are most common? So that would be the purview of latent transition analysis, which is a longitudinal extension of latent class analysis. Another longitudinal extension of latent class analysis is the growth mixture model, which we've seen a lot of applications of in recent years. And in the growth mixture model, that takes a kind of a traditional growth curve model where we're interested in individual differences and starting points and rates of change on some behavior of interest. And we look at whether those individual differences group into sort of prototypical patterns. So do we see subgroups characterized by different developmental trends? Moving outside of this political science kind of example, a common exemplar for when a growth mixture model might be useful is looking at the development of antisocial behavior. Terry Moffat has a theory that there are a couple of different developmental patterns for antisocial behavior. One is life course persistent. These are individuals that show an earlier onset and persistent antisocial behavior later in development into adulthood. And then another pattern that's adolescent limited, that engage in antisocial behavior only during an adolescent period and then sort of age out. So those are a couple of different developmental patterns, and then of course we might expect a group with very little antisocial behavior at any point, and we could use a growth mixture model to try to identify those patterns and see whether or not they're consistent with that theory. So those are a couple of extensions. Another extension, and this one we can draw more on this example for, is a factor mixture model. So we might say, well, actually I think both exist, that there are continuous latent factors that represent degree of fiscal conservatism and degree of social conservatism and degree of sort of toughness on foreign and domestic issues. And so I want to retain that three-class structure that we saw earlier, but I'm going to graft these latent classes on top. And so I think that those factors exist, but I also believe that there are subgroups defined on the basis of these factors. And so a factor mixture model is a way of going after that. So we can combine models that have discrete latent classes with models that contain continuous latent factors. So there are a variety of possible extensions we can make to this latent class model, and that's one of the exciting things about the generalized latent variable modeling framework that's been developed over the last decade. So I hope this gives you a sense of what these models are useful for, the kinds of insights they can bring, how they contrast with more traditional factor analysis, and I thank you for your time.